Are there some places where you feel closer to God than others? I wonder how you'd answer that question. Some folks, I'm sure, will say in a church building. And we have some beautiful churches, some awesome buildings. And certainly these will have been places where you have felt God's presence. And yet, for even more people, a sense of wonder, a sense of awe, a sense of God that is enlivening is found on the hills, on the mountains. I was chatting this week with Douglas Wilson about hill walking, and he was recalling various occasions when he'd been out walking, some of which took his breath away, and then others, like the one where he'd hit the flask in one hand and his cup in the other, and yet because of the conditions he failed to get any liquid actually into the cup. And then there's the other occasion in the lakes when Shona the collie he was walking suddenly stopped and refused to go on climbing up the hillside. It just wouldn't budge, such that the party headed up in a different direction. Only after ascending by a different route did it become apparent that where they had originally planned to go, there had been a landslip. David the psalmist and shepherd frequently uses the mountains as a way of stretching our minds to consider God and God's ways and God's glory. Psalm 36. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mighty mountains. Your judgments are like the great deep. You save humans and animals alike, O Lord. Psalm 76. Glorious are you, more majestic than the everlasting mountains. Psalm 90. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever, you had formed the earth and the world. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Psalm 125. Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved, but abides forever. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people, from this time on and forevermore. In the Bible, it was on Mount Moriah that Abraham was tested. It was on Mount Sinai that Moses received the Ten Commandments. It was on Mount Carmel that Elijah defeated the prophets of Baal. Jerusalem is built on Mount Zion. In the New Testament, Jesus' most well-known teaching was the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus regularly retreats to the mountains to pray. And in the passage we read, there is a mountaintop experience for the disciples. In the cloud and bright sun, it appears that Jesus is shining, but is joined also by Moses and Elijah. This is the one I love. Follow him. And finally, Jesus is crucified on a hill, the hill of Calvary. Why do we climb mountains? The classic answer is, well, because they're there. There is something in us that is curious, is enchanted by the scale and the grandeur of that peak. We climb to glimpse the view from the top. We climb a mountain to get a perspective upon our lives and our world. In short, climbing mountains leads us to new vision. For as long as humankind has engaged in spiritual searching, we've turned to the mountains for inspiration and challenge, and have seen the ascent as a metaphor for our spiritual journey. The climb demands strenuous effort. Some may even feel daunted by the thought of it. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? We talk about reaching for the sky. For much of our faith is about searching for God, getting a wider perspective, not settling for yesterday's path and experience, but pushing on to get an ever-increasing sense of wonder and love. I believe that God invites each of us to search for him. Romans chapter 1 says God has put eternity in our hearts, and yet we don't know it. And yet, in his mystery and grace, as we do this searching, perhaps we see better our lives in the everyday, more attuned to hearing the birds and the babies, the chords of love that connect them all. And so let me finish with a story called God's Mountain by Trevor Dennis. I've adapted the story. It was indeed an awe-inspiring sight. It rose dark and threatening, its top many thousands of feet above the surrounding plain, and shrouded always in mist, the holy mountain of God. The mountain where the story goes, God had met his people, and surely he'd come to them once again. And so, there was a perpetual stirring of seekers after truth, seekers after love, after life in the highest, after God. They came searching in their thousands. Bands of young men came laughing and joking, each trying to give the impression that he did not mind the conditions on the midges. There were small children for whom this was a great adventure, some asleep on their father's shoulders, or some carried by their mothers. And behind them all came the old, the blind, and the lame, stumbling, gasping in the strangeness of the times, but like everyone else drawn to the great surge of rock ahead of them. The rich came and parked their Range Rovers. The poor came with open hands and open longings. Saints and holy women came together with the godless and the wicked. Ruthlessness and cruelty were among them, and greed and lust and hatred. Love was there in all her fierceness, with hope and love, with gentleness and with fine humility. Many joys came to that mountain, many sadnesses and griefs too. All travelled to the one mountain and for one purpose. No one was utterly certain that he would show up. All had, however, their hopes, even if they would not admit to them. The mountain held them in its spell. For as they reached the foot of the mountain, so their exhaustion united them, and they sank back. No one dared venture on the slopes above. This was God's mountain, not theirs. And so there they camped, waiting for what they knew not. But they were sure there would be thunder and lightning and smoke and fire. This was what they expected. So soon after the sun had gone down and the mist at the top began to look more like smoke, they were not surprised when a violent storm suddenly broke upon them. They huddled together, their collars pulled tight against the wind and the rain. The vast black sides of the mountain bent over them. They were dwarfed by them and made to feel as nothing. And at the height of the storm, it seemed like the mountain would break open and fall on their heads. Yet in the midst of the terror they still waited, for surely he had come to his mountain in the storm. But no voice came. Perhaps after the storm. Yes, that was it. When it dawned, when the storm had subsided, all eyes turned towards the summit. The mist had lifted. The very peak could be seen, no longer black and menacing, but shining gold and pink in the first rays of the new sun. Then it was that God came to his mountain. Then it was in the deep silence of that dawn that God spoke to his people. But not from the summit. No. He spoke from among them, from their very midst, down there on the plain at the mountain's foot. For just as the storm ended, in the middle of that great mass of people, a young woman gave birth to a baby. And in the silence of that dawn, the child uttered its first cry. God had spoken. Emmanuel.